Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the A to Z Poll podcast. My name is Zachary Siegel, and today we have kind of a different episode. The rest of the year, we are going to kind of format this in a slightly different way because, similarly to the AP poll, the A to Z poll now does not matter. What was once the reigning authority in college football orders and stuff like that, the A to Z poll, I mean, is now rendered relatively unimportant based off of these CFP polls that have now come out. These polls directly are the projections and how the not projections they are directly how the college football playoff system will work. Therefore, they are the only thing that matter right now. Now, before we get into it, make sure that you like and subscribe everywhere you're watching. Go follow me on X at Zach_Siegel32. Go find the A to Z poll on YouTube. Go find the A to Z poll podcast on Spotify. And go check out Hoops from the Hills, where I also do more college basketball related content. All right. Without further ado, I'm going to tell you guys the list, and we're going to get to my top five biggest takeaways from the CFP committee poll. All right, starting out from the top, number one is Oregon, number two is Ohio State, number three is Texas, number four is Penn State, fifth Indiana, six BYU, seven is Tennessee, eight is Notre Dame, nine is Miami, 10 is Alabama, 11 is Ole Miss, 12 is Georgia, 13 is Boise State, 14 is Southern Methodist, 15 is Texas A&M, 16 is Kansas State, 17 is Colorado, 18 is Washington State, 19 is Louisville, 20 is Clemson, 21 is South Carolina, 22 is LSU, 23 is Mizzou, 24 is Army, and number 25 is Tulane. Now, I'm not exactly going to talk about if I like a lot of these picks, right? Because it really doesn't matter at this point if I like or dislike a lot of these picks. This is going to be my kind of analysis of what I think based off of what I see here. Now, firstly, I want to explain, what this kind of means and how the actual, rankings will look like, what this means and how the playoff system actually works. If you're a long time watcher, you'll know that I've explained this before, but but I'm going to go over it one more time because there's a lot of crazy things could happen right now. So, firstly, there are still a lot of teams that can make the CFP right now, the playoff, even ones that aren't even in the top 25. Uh, the the best example of that, I think, right now, of a team that can make it from potentially make it is none other than West Virginia. They have a long road to get there, but they, in theory, could make it. Um, because they're just not mathematically eliminated, right? So if West Virginia were to win out, step one, Colorado drops a game, uh, Kansas State or Iowa State drop one, and then whichever one of those lost loses again to each other because they play at the end of the year, and then BYU loses out or wins out, sorry, then West Virginia would find themselves in the Big 12 championship, find themselves in the Big 12 championship potentially as an unranked team, and then winning would now mean that there is an unranked team who's a major power conference champion. Now, what could happen with something like that is if you took the 12th spot, right? Because as we know, the 1 through 4 is the top four ranked conference winners, and the 12th spot is the fifth ranked conference winner. If that happened, and if you say for argument's sake, we take Boise State and they win, they win the Mountain West, then most likely you will have West Virginia, the Big 12, represented in the 12th seed as opposed to the fourth seed, and and Boise State represented in the fourth seed, and then assuming the ACC is above them, the ACC, Big Ten, and SEC championships representing the 1 through 4 or 1 through 3. Now that being said, um, obviously that is a far-fetched scenario, but there are legitimate scenarios like that. Now, going into my five main points. One of those points is actually going to be more of an explanation of what I just talked about, but let's just start it off. Let's just kick it off. Number one, Indiana being ranked over Brigham Young University. I don't think that this is that egregious, and I think there's absolutely an argument to be made from it. But I think that anyone with eyes has seen that BYU has had a more impressive season than Indiana, based from competition to um, general like quality wins. I think BYU has done better, but I have three reasons why I think that Indiana is ranked above BYU. Firstly, conference supremacy. I think in this new era of college football athletics, you can uh, it's going to favor the Big Ten and the SEC. So if you have two teams, like I said, that are similar, like BYU and Indiana, the Big Ten school or the SEC school is going to take precedent over the ACC or Big 12 school. That's just what I think is going to happen. Um, I think it rewards Big Ten play, and especially now with even with if Indiana wasn't in the top five, even with three of the top four teams from the Big Ten, it is viewed that the Big Ten is the premier conference. And I think it's kind of interesting. I got into a Twitter conversation about this today. It is interesting to look at where you see all these SEC teams lose, and the CFP committee looks at that and says, well, that's because this SEC is such good competition that it's way too difficult to have an elite team. They're all elite there already for the Big Ten and the SEC. As I mean, besides Oregon, at the Big Ten and the SEC have no undefeated teams except for Oregon and Indiana. On the other hand, if you when you look at the ACC and Big 12, the CFP committee treats teams with a couple 1 to 3 losses there as, oh well, they're just not good enough to take advantage of this poor competition there. There's definitely a little bit of a double standard, I think, that comes from this, and definitely more of a power to agenda. We'll see how this metastasizes throughout the next couple of years in 2 years from now, and they get to remake like auto bids and things like that. But as of now, it's definitely trending in a obviously more like a power to sort of Big Ten SEC supremacy situation. Number two, to why I think Indiana is ranked over BYU is I think that Indiana, although playing lesser competition, has beat their teams worse than BYU has. BYU really has only blown out one team, and ironically, it was number 17, 16, Kansas State. But outside of that, BYU has had some pretty lackluster victories. Not that they haven't won fair and square, but Indiana, aside from actually last game, has pretty handily dismantled every single one of their teams that they've played. And so I think that the CFP committee is rewarding beating teams you should beat by a lot over beating teams that you necessarily weren't supposed to beat at all. Whether or not I agree with that, again, doesn't necessarily matter. But that is the second reason. And now the number three reason, I think they did this last year. The CFP committee did this last year with the SEC, but I think that by propping up Indiana, they now make Ohio State, Oregon, and Penn State and the entire Big Ten look better. And I really think they did this with Mizzou last year, leaving them in the top 10 to prop up an Alabama win to convince us that they should be over Florida State, to say, oh well, that's another top 10 win that they have, even though I think anybody with eyes could see that Mizzou was just simply not a top 10 team at the end of last season. If now the CFP committee, by saying that Indiana is what, fifth in the country, seeing that Indiana is fifth in the country means that they are they are now able to, if they win this week, right, and go into Ohio State, or sorry, they don't play this week. So if they go into Ohio State 10-0 as the fifth or fourth best team in the country, they will now get to, and Ohio State loses. Now that's a two-loss team, but the CFP committee can justify giving them give them the fifth or sixth slot in the playoffs, because they can say, oh well, look at those two losses, two quality losses. And although, I think that that's not necessarily right, that's part of the reason why I think that Indiana is propped up as high as they are. I do think Indiana is a very good team, and I think they deserve to be this high. I think they might not be. I definitely have my own personal gripes in the top 10. I don't think I would have put them fifth, but there's a lot still that we have to talk about. Um, Number two, Notre Dame in the playoffs as an eight seed, but Georgia not being there. Notre Dame has just not had the impressive enough season that I thought they should have had in order to justify getting past 5-4 Northern Illinois. Actually, as of time recording, they won their game last night. But regardless, this Georgia's two losses came from top 10 teams, right? Two teams that in number 11 Ole Miss and number 10 Alabama that are currently projected to be in the playoff, and not to mention they beat number three Texas, right? So having Georgia missing the playoffs right now, but having Notre Dame number eighth feels a little bit odd to me, considering that Georgia had the most difficult schedule in college football this year. Notre Dame did not. I mean, I remember talking earlier. I said, well, they need to make some big wins. I mean, they beat Louisville. Great. Louisville now is irrelevant. They beat Navy. Great. Navy is now irrelevant. They beat Florida State. Great. Florida State had the worst season they've probably had in 20 years. Notre Dame didn't have any quality wins. The best win they had by far was Texas A&M in the beginning of the season, and I think that you honestly, I don't even need to take that in consideration. You're talking about a Texas A&M team that has done some major growing and is still even in contention for the college football playoff with their first time with Mike Elko against um against a very seasoned uh in Notre Dame head coach. I think that that is a little bit of a blunder on them. I understand putting them below Ole Miss and Alabama because both those teams beat them, but I think that we all know, maybe we don't know. I think that if Georgia, if I'm a betting man, right? If I'm willing to put money on this and straight up win or loss, and even in a even away, I think Georgia would still beat Ole Miss or Alabama. Now, this was not Georgia's best game they just played. Obviously, they lost pretty bad to Ole Miss, but again, I think Georgia at their best is better than all but two of these teams on this list. Maybe all but one of these teams on this list. Um, Moving on to number three. This isn't really a gripe with the list as much as it is with the current system and just kind of an unfortunacy for this team. But the Washington State dilemma. I don't feel like I hear enough people talking about Washington State and the really, really great season they've had, especially since they've only taken one loss, which was a one-score loss to Boise State, and have played a lot of the same competition as Boise State. And if you look, have beaten some of them better. Um, Washington State's going to miss the playoffs, right? That's just a thing that's going to happen. They're 18th in the poll. Even if they won out, they have no conference championship to lean back on, and they already lost their one game of the season that could actually have meant something. And if they had beaten them, then that game wouldn't have meant a lot because Boise State wouldn't be nearly as high. Now, with that being said, I think that it's mainly due to the fact that there is this weird Pac-2 situation, and nobody's really sure whether to treat them as a power team or a non-power team because like they are, but they're not because their conference isn't really recognized. But I mean, if they end the season 11-1, I mean, that's a really good season that's just going to be rewarded with nothing. And I'm not saying that they should kick someone out, but I think that maybe there should have been something in place in the beginning of the season that although they're not in the Mountain West, that they could get some sort of recognition and potentially even compete for that Mountain West title spot. Um, because I mean, they got some dogs on that team. I mean, John Mateer has been one of the is arguably a top 10 quarterback this season, and again, it just feels like they're out in no man's land in this weird purgatory between power and group that where they're not going to be able to get any recognition for it. And it wasn't really a gripe with the list or anything like that. It was just or anything even really that much of notice about the list specifically. It was just like kind of feel bad for Washington State. I mean, at the end of the day, I know they could have probably tried to join the Big 12 or the ACC or the Big 10 or something like that. But I understand why they stayed. I mean, I don't know if I'd want to spend the travel budget. And now the Pac-12 is getting rebuilt with with some Mountain West teams next year, and maybe, even including Boise State. So who knows what that'll look like and how that'll metastasize. Alrighty. Number four. Again, not a gripe, but kind of what I was talking about earlier, where Boise State right now is a real shot to get that fourth seed and a couple you know, and a and a couple buys along the way. And frankly, if they get the four seed, I don't think it's a guarantee necessarily that, whichever ACC or Big 12 team that they kick out is going to get that 12th spot. Right now, Miami is so this is the scenario that I laid out and thought of beforehand to talk about. Miami is ninth. SMU, who's technically first in the ACC, is 14th, and Boise State is 13th. If Miami wins out, making them a much higher seed than Boise State, SMU, wins just enough, maybe loses one more, but finds themselves in the ACC championship, and Boise State wins out, winning the Mountain West. And then SMU beats Miami in the championship, and Boise State wins the Mountain West. Boise State will be higher than uh, Boise State will be higher than SMU, giving Boise State the edge over Southern Methodist. Now, further point, if Southern Methodist were to lose maybe two games, but then we also see like a Clemson lose two games and Pitt or Louisville never really comes back and reclaims anything, then we could see a situation where right now Army and Tulane are both 24-25. If they continue to win games, I mean, hey, I'm going to the Tulane game this week against Navy. If they win out and they keep winning out in good fashion, and one of them ends up being a higher overall by the CFP committee at the end, that's a situation where like SMU and the ACC just get no representation, and you have a Mountain West fourth seed and an AAC 12th seed. Now, I do think that there is a little bit of a of a safety for that to happen. I don't think there's anything official, but I would have a really hard time seeing SMU in the conference championship getting ranked lower than either Army or Tulane, right? I can see the CFP committee making them take, kind of their like slap on the wrist of embarrassment, get the 12th seed, but I think we're still very, very far fetched from that, missing it entirely. Now, that does, I think, lead me into some things um, where I do think that that does lead me to some things where I do think that it would be the most fair to say if you did do it the way where SMU were to miss, but I think there's definitely some I mean, I don't think the 12 team playoff is a perfect system, but I think it's much better than the 14 that we had before. All right, final point, and definitely a gripe, and this is kind of a bigger overarching issue. Again, not particularly with the list itself, but my final point is kind of that there aren't really set criteria that determine stuff, right? The only criteria that determines things specifically for like positioning is conference championship, you get it, right? But on the other hand, even that, like the order in which they're in, is pretty random. It honestly, and I don't really have a better way to say this, but it really feels like the committee chooses teams based off of vibes. And I think sometimes the vibes might be better than the way they're actually playing. And I think that happens a lot with the SEC and Big Ten. Kind of what I was talking about earlier. The SEC and Big Ten are beating up on each other because there are just no elite teams that can handle, that big load. Like I think that would lead for something like a 9-3 Georgia, if they were to lose to Tennessee this weekend, to end up, making their way into the playoff over, you know, a 12-1 BYU that could potentially lose in the conference championship, but still had an undefeated season up until then and should probably make it. It's the kind of thing like that where I think you kind of need to create some parity or you are going to just create these power eight teams, not even really power conferences, but like a power like eight teams among a couple conferences. um I think that there's like some examples where like you can get a team that gets some crazy NIL, And I think a team that like kind of one we were just talking about, like SMU seems like a great example of a team where like if they won or at least competed in multiple playoffs and for a national championship within the next 5 to 10 years, would not at all surprise me. And that might be a great thing for the ACC, even if the ACC isn't, overall much better of a conference. And I mean, also the ACC outplayed the SEC last year in head-to-head matchups. Just saying. Um, but if SMU, is a dominant enough team, that could definitely help bring some more parity back to the college football landscape. And I thought SMU specifically because of NIL, right? Now we live in a world where, in theory, enough money could win you a national championship, which take it or leave it, good or bad. But I do think at the end of the day, it does create a more a more balanced system to some extent. I also think there's obviously some problems with it as well. But like a school like SMU, who basically did do that in the 80s and 90s, then got the death penalty. I think if you take an SMU team who is just willing to put like willing to get that Dallas Fort Worth spender base in on them, I think that could be a team that really takes a step up to the next level. Alrighty. In conclusion, we just got about 3 weeks of the regular season left. It's going to be pretty much what we're going to be doing here is analyzing the CFP's committee's attempt to make ratings. We're going to have problems with them. We're going to like some stuff. We're going to not like some stuff. We're going to talk about what things mean. Um, but this is we've probably seen the last of the traditional A to Z poll podcast style of least of this season. But hey, we got to do what the CFP committee dictates, right? That being said, everybody enjoy your week. Go watch some football, and I hope your team wins. Bye bye.